When I was growing up in the 1950s, I was fed a steady diet of cowboy culture. My friends and I loved to play cowboys and Indians. I grew up near Davy Crockett High School, and though we were 1,000 miles away from Texas, nothing seemed more American than the Alamo and John Wayne. But what did those movies, those names on the buildings, leave out of the story? Where does Texas history begin? And what am I supposed to remember about the Alamo? I went down to Texas to find out. The Lone Star State has loomed large in the American imagination. We're told it's a place committed to independent thinking and the resolute protection of its borders. But Texas flew 4 other flags before it became a state. Today, public historians are on the front lines. They're reshaping our notions of how Texas became Texas. I went to meet some of those historians, and I started my journey at the Bullock Texas State History Museum in Austin. For thousands of years here, American Indians, the first Americans, built nations and tribes that occupied this land. They farmed, hunted, raised families, fought wars. These societies grew and flourished before colonists from Spain and then France arrived in this area. In all my years teaching American history, I have to admit that France has seldom come to mind when thinking of Texas history. But as it turned out, France launched an expedition in the 1680s to establish a colony here. A remarkable discovery allows us to see the hopes and plans of that journey in astounding detail. Margaret Cook, director of the museum, offered us a look deep into the Texas past.
So the ship is an amazing archaeological find that was excavated off the coast of Matagorda Bay in the 90s by the Texas Historical Commission. It is about a third of a ship called La Belle that sank in the bay in a storm, but it was part of an expedition led by Sieur de La Salle from France, with 3 other ships when they started out, about 300 colonists and about 100 soldiers, to make a French impact at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Now you might wonder, if they were looking for the Mississippi River.
I did wonder that.
How did they end up in Matagorda Bay, Texas? Well, a lot of faulty maps, not having tools to find the mouth of the Mississippi. They sailed past it, saw the coast of Texas. LaSalle thought, I'm close by, and they ended up making camp. Now, LaSalle had been down the Mississippi before, just 3 years prior. He'd had a very successful expedition to Canada, had come down the Mississippi River, which gave him this idea of, we need a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi and claiming all of these territories to the west of the Mississippi for France. So he made a plea to King Louis when he got back to France. Louis said, aha, well, I'll give you 2 ships, and by the way, while you're there, make sure that you investigate those Spanish silver mines. It all comes back to economics.
So it's France and Spain jostling with one another, kind of racing to take wherever this new area might be?
Exactly. Spain, up to this point, was not really interested in Texas all that much. There were hundreds of thousands of American Indians from different tribes that were here. It seemed to them to be a rather hostile territory. They had thriving ports in Mexico, they had Mexico City. They were doing just fine. But once the French set foot in their territory, that changed everything.
I see. LaSalle and the other colonists tried for 2 years to find the Mississippi River. When La Belle sank in a storm and tensions rose, LaSalle was murdered. The expedition failed, and France's stake in Texas was gone. LaSalle's wrecked ship tells his story. It's remarkable that this ship endures all that time. Why was that around all the way until the 1990s? What allowed it to exist?
It's really pretty amazing, right? The reason that they were able to find a third of the ship was that it was in silt. This silt in 12 feet of water had preserved it all this time.
It looks great to be that old. On the other hand, it looks as if it might come apart.
It did come out in pieces. And then they reassembled it at Marine Archaeology Lab at Texas A&M University in College Station. They built a giant freeze dryer, and they put the pieces of the ship in the freeze dryer to get all the moisture out of it. And then in a temporary exhibition here a couple years ago, the conservator and the curator on the project assembled it piece by piece in the gallery. So it became this learning opportunity for everyone. And we're just thrilled to have it here.
LaSalle's ship represents a brief moment in Texas history, but the way the French spurred Spanish activity in the region was long-lasting. Spain established missions throughout its North American empire, and many of these were in Texas, including 5 around what is now San Antonio. I met Jorge Hernandez, a guide with the National Park Service at Mission San Jose. He told me about Spain's ambitions in this place.
It's 2 Catholic powers competing with one another, right? But through very different strategies.
The idea was always to have that buffer zone, you know, keep away the French. And one way to keep away the French is to have subjects in here, you know. So the King of Spain can say, oh, I have subjects in South Texas, that land belongs to me. Spain tried to bring their culture, language, and religion to this place and to keep it in here, you know. That's why a mission was a place of acculturation, assimilation, and change and adaptation.
The American Indians willing to join the Jesuits inside the mission's walls were often members of small bands that sought protection from the larger nations of the Apaches and the Comanches, who ranged across the vast landscape on horseback.
We're talking about hunters and gatherers that, if you think about it, they depended a lot on nature to survive, you know? So the Franciscan missionaries and Spanish soldiers utilized that factor to convince them, you know, food, you know? In a mission, the Spanish introduced agriculture. That means plenty of food supply. So food attracted a lot of indigenous people into the mission. But that's not to say that not a lot of people wanted to accept this Spanish way of life. There was a lot of passive protest in a mission, people abandoning these places constantly because they didn't want to become a Spanish subject.
So they would come for a while, try it out, and decide, no, I'd rather be who I was?
Yeah. Exactly, and some of them stay in here. Throughout the years, a balance was found, you know. As you're gonna see, Mission San Jose is the largest, so something happened in here that made this community work, you know. That balance of allowing Coahuiltecans, indigenous people of this place, to bring a piece of their culture into a mission and then mix it with the Spanish beliefs, and eventually created the culture that we have here in San Antonio, the Tejano culture.
The American Indians who chose to live in the missions converted to Christianity, but they found ways to blend the doctrine of the Catholic Church with their own faith traditions. Today, the San Antonio missions form a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and Jorge told me that there's a vision of Texas here, a vision of America, bigger and bolder than we might guess.
The story that we tell, you know, is still alive. You know, all of the mission churches are active parishes. So you have masses every weekend, you have weddings, funerals, quinceañeras, you know, and the people who attend to these places are mission descendants, you know. Born and raised here in Texas, you know, the story of Spanish colonization is embedded in you. So for me, this is something that you learn in elementary, you know, but interacting with visitors that come from all over the world, you know, sometimes you have to start a talk from point zero, you know, because what's the American experience, you know? Is it only what happened on the East Coast? Is it only happened when the Europeans arrived? But it starts with the indigenous people that inhabit in these areas, you know, and the mixing of cultures that happen afterwards. So for me, working at missions or places like the missions, you know, it's not only a personal connection because my roots are embedded in this, you know, but it's a personal connection when I'm trying to tell the whole image of the American experience, you know, which includes all of the geographic area.
I wanted to follow deeper the roots of that American experience in Texas. So I met with Ramon Vasquez. Ramon is a descendant of American Indians who chose to move into the missions. Through tours and events, Ramon educates visitors about the contributions of American Indians to making San Antonio and Texas what they are today.
So each one of the missions that were built here in San Antonio were built because of the amount of people that were here. So there's no other place in the country that has 5 missions 3 miles apart from each other.
Right.
All built within a 25, 30-year time period. And the reason was because it was full of people.
Huh.
There's over 100 different tribal bands and clans documented in the records here.
100?
Yeah, but so we didn't have the same tribal complex in terms of how they were organized, like you would find in the plains. These were bands and clans. This was the home of the Tilahai, the Yirpipiamos, the Pacawanit, the Paguames, the Payayas. These are the names that have been documented in all the records.
So how would you describe the attitudes of all these diverse peoples? Obviously, they would have diverse attitudes, right, about something like this mission arising in their midst. So tell me what that would have looked like.
Some of the families would have said, we have to go in, we have to follow this people because of things were changing. We had the Apaches coming in from the north, diseases were infesting our communities here, and the Spanish were coming up also from the south. Some of those family members said, we have to move in with these and follow these Spaniards, knowing that their lives as they knew it were going to cease to exist. But at least they will be alive, and it maybe was their best chance for survival. And then there was the other ones that said, we're gonna stay who we are today and we'll die who we are today. And they made the choice. And I asked people, I said, which one of them was right? Because all we know is that people made choices based on that time and what was going on at that time. And we're very fortunate that we can be here talking to you because somebody made a decision like that. And we're fortunate that we don't have to make that decision today.
Right. So it's a complex history of creating the missions and negotiating. How did that evolve over time?
One of the things that happened in our history is that all this land was then turned in trust to the church. And our families became wards of the church. And so many of the families, like the families that come to this church, are still members of the same family that came to the church from 1731.
Wow.
When it comes to perseverance, I think our story here is one of those top 5 American stories of perseverance.
Yeah. The people who lived at the mission died there as well, often of disease, and were buried within its walls. Ramon and fellow descendants worked to protect those remains in the memory of their ancestors.
This is the unfinished church. It's also our Campo Santo, our holy ground, our burial ground. One of our deepest betrayals and injustices happened in 1967 to our families. They came in 1967 while our men were in Vietnam. Back home, they were digging up our gravesites.
Why?
Well, they said for study, that they wanted to study them.
Wow.
Without thinking, that there's people who are still connected to these people. After 30 years of fighting, trying to find out where the remains were, we actually won that struggle to get the remains back. We laid them back to rest here. And then, since then, every year, we have an all-night visual.
So your passion's clear. How would you describe what it is that drives you to do this work?
We were thought to be extinct. And so we have an obligation to reverse extinction because there were so many contributions that we made historically. First of all, we were glad to be able to be here, to be found by the Spanish, right? We were glad to be here. But not just that, we built these missions.
Right.
We became the artists. We became the cowboys. We drove the 10,000 heads of cattle to support the American Revolution. We contributed then, and today we're doctors, lawyers, students, teachers, politicians. We're still contributing.
So it doesn't sound as if you see the end of your work coming anytime soon, huh?
No. Our job is to make sure that when people leave this place, that you understand that there's a living connection to them. It's not just walls, bricks and mortar.
The missions thrived for several decades, but disease took a toll, while Spain lost interest in controlling the northern frontier. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, American Indians still controlled the land and trade in much of northern and eastern Texas. Mexico had few citizens and few military outposts there, so the government had little authority. Now, Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1829, but faced with the Texas region slipping from their grasp, Mexican leaders made a compromise. Mexico opened the region to Anglo-American cotton planters, immigrants from the United States. They were led by a man named Stephen F. Austin. Hundreds of slaveholders poured in, and they changed Texas forever. I came to see this history at Varner Hog Plantation. Martin Varner, one of the first planters to arrive in East Texas, established the plantation in 1824. Later, the Patton family enslaved more than 50 people here to grow and process sugarcane. Naomi Carrier, a former teacher and principal, now gives living history presentations. She helped me understand how slavery and freedom were intertwined from the very beginning of Anglo-American presence in Texas. So hundreds of enslaved people lived on this land, right? What evidence do we have that we can still see today that they were here?
We have the bricks that they made with their hands from the mud of the Brazos River. We have the kettles that they stood over boiling the sugar cane. We have that sugar mill ruin right there. And of course, the slave quarters was back there, and we could see the 5-by-5 yard foundation of a cabin that probably was brick.
So all those things are helpful to us, but it also means we have to work hard to imagine the lives that people lived, right? And that's been your life's work, right? Is populating and bringing those people to life.
I helped to draft the master interpretive plan for Varner Hogg, and it was at that time that we, as you say, revisionist history, we kind of revisioned the interpretation to include more about the enslavement period.
Right. So let's talk about the enslaved people who were brought here. When, why?
Well, Stephen F. Austin came to assume his father's contract with Mexico in 1821.
Okay.
So, and with him, having been given a contract to bring in 300 families, which we call Austin's old 300 colonists, then each one of those colonists, no doubt, brought some enslaved people with them.
Where are they coming from mainly?
They're mainly coming from the South, but as far north as Kentucky and Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, all of the South, because in a lot of places in the South, they had worn out the land.
Right.
And so without any crop rotation, they were kind of forced to move.
Right. And so did Mexico care that they were bringing enslaved people with them?
Mexico did care. Mexico did not want them bringing in slaves, but we have to realize that Mexico was a very young country who had just won its independence from Spain.
Right.
So there was some vacillation on that, but they brought in slaves.
Hundreds more families moved into the Mexican state of Texas to establish plantations. The enormous profits made from cotton and sugar grew the Texas economy and gave planters reasons to fight to protect slavery. Soon, more enslaved people than free Anglo settlers lived in Texas.
In this county alone, there were about 55 plantations of the caliber you see here.
Wow.
It was enormously profitable, and as profitable as it was on this hand, it was extremely labor intensive.
Right.
Persons who were employed in the production of sugarcane might only live 3 years or up to 7 years.
So why do you think this is not more of a part of the story that Texans tell about themselves and that the rest of the country tells about the settlement of Texas? Why is there this amnesia, do you think?
Bad for business and such an ugly story. What is needed in the state of Texas and maybe many other places is a center for education and reconciliation.
We can imagine that the first step toward reconciliation is actual knowledge, right?
Yes.
And then acknowledgement,
Right.
And then what you're doing with living history and places like this that allow people to make an emotional engagement with the past,
Yes.
right? I like to imagine somewhere along the way they need books, since that's the only thing I know how to do. But we can see the immediate impact, being able just to talk with the person one-on-one.
And because it is my responsibility to tell the story, but as ugly as the story is, I don't have to negotiate the truth. The truth is the truth.
So do you find that there's a greater hunger for living history, or is there a greater hunger for the truth?
There is a hunger for the truth, because the truth is healing.
Slaveholders prospered, but they had to contend with the Mexican government, which sought to exert more control over trade and immigration in the Mexican state of Texas. Ernesto Rodriguez, a historian at the Alamo, explained how this tension contributed to the famous battle that took place there.
When Mexico starts its immigration policies, people are being offered land at 12.5 cents an acre.
Wow.
People start flocking over. First 300 families come in, and
As immigrants.
As
that's
immigrants,
important
yes.
to understand.
And-
Americans are the immigrants.
yes,
of this
Americans are, they're becoming Mexican citizens, and they take on the Mexican ideas for the most part.
Huh.
The Constitution of 1824 is based on the American Constitution, so it's not too much of a difference. The only thing is, states have more rights in the Mexican Constitution than in the U.S.
Huh.
The only problem is, by 1828, the Mexican government's like, man, there's too many immigrants coming
Yeah,
over.
right.
And they're not doing it legally. They're not using the right processes. They're just crossing over and squatting on land. With the election of 1833, you have this new president come in. His name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna.
I've heard of him.
And he centralizes all authority in Mexico City. Now imagine coming from a country like the United States where you have this republic you fought for,
Right.
and having all your rights taken away, it really stirs up the pot. So now you have this group of Mexican natives, which we now refer to as Tejanos, that are joining up with these group of immigrants and saying, we believe the same way, we have the same ideas, and we're now going to fight together. It starts setting the stage in which you've got the Mexican government coming to basically reclaim their territory against a group of insurgents.
The Texians, as the insurgents called themselves, occupied an old Spanish mission, San Antonio de Valero, known as the Alamo. Santa Anna's forces attacked the Alamo to take it back. Hundreds of Texians and Mexicans were killed, and Mexico claimed victory. Just days before the battle at the Alamo, Texians declared independence from Mexico and founded the Republic of Texas. After the Alamo, Texian troops tracked down Santa Anna's forces. They captured him, and they forced him to sign a treaty. The immigrants had their own country, and slavery was legal. The battle at the Alamo is a flashpoint in a long struggle among many different groups over who would control Texas. And yet, we often think of the Alamo as the beginning of Texas history. I asked Bruce Winders, another historian at the site, why this myth looms so large in the American imagination.
So I have to admit, the church is smaller than you might expect, judging from all the representations you see of it, right? Do you get any people saying, no, really, where's the Alamo?
It's a good entry-level question because it allows us to go, well, you're looking at the church, and you've been trained, because we've helped you be trained, to think of the Alamo as the church.
Right.
But it's actually the plaza that's in front of it. So we're able to go, you think it's small, turn around and we'll show you where it is. And then they go, oh, it's so much bigger than I thought.
What do they think they're coming to see?
What they don't really know. Often in the past, it was they're coming to see John Wayne's movie set because that was the Alamo.
Right.
And
that was entirely accurate, I'm imagining.
it was accurate if you wanted it to be.
Okay. What conceptions and misconceptions and preconceptions do visitors show up with today?
Well, I'm pausing because
There's so many?
so few.
Ah, interesting.
Because many people come and it's like, I've heard of the Alamo and I've done my duty. I remember the Alamo. What am I supposed to remember? And so it gives us the opportunity to tell different stories.
Right.
What we tend to tell people is the Battle of the Alamo isn't over the Alamo. It's over who controls the town. And the response will be, what town? And so we get to tell about how the Alamo is the seed from which San Antonio grows. And whoever controls San Antonio controls Texas. What I find is there's a great hunger out there for people for history. And it isn't, tell me the stories that I grew up with. Because we're reaching a period where some people aren't growing up with stories.
Right.
So they're coming here and what is this place? In this hunger, it's tell me about the past. And what they're really saying is, tell me who I am.
And be honest about it, right?
And be honest about
I
it.
find that that's the hunger young people have. Yeah, look, I can take it.
Yeah.
What actually happened? I'd rather know that than some mythology.
You know, Texas is quintessentially American, but not for the reasons I was taught growing up. Texas has a mix of peoples and cultures that could hardly happen anywhere else. In fact, it's defined by the intersection of the worlds that have made it. We have our stories of cowboys and conquest, but then we have the real Texas, a place of battles and exchange, a place of community and creativity. And it's a place that we're still discovering.